Okay, we're going to talk today about warfare amongst the Europeans in the 1600s, mostly amongst themselves, against each other. Warfare is an extremely important topic to talk about for an entire lecture because it gives us a window into a lot of major developments in Europe in the century, largely the political developments, who's in control of what countries and who's really powerful on the continental and worldwide stage in the century, but also the wars that the Europeans fight against each other on almost a constant basis in the 1600s and early 1700s has a big impact on a lot of different aspects of Europe, especially European economics, as countries that are fighting wars have to figure out how to get tax revenue to pay for the wars. And the wars themselves encourage a lot of technological development and scientific innovation as countries try to figure out how to make more powerful armies and make their armies as strong as possible for every dollar that they're spending, basically. So the wars encourage a lot of different developments throughout European society that will become important later on as we get into the course. So the major conflicts that we're going to talk about today are really divided into two different kind of series of conflicts. The first one is the 30 Years' War that dominated the first half of the century. And then after that, Louis XIV, the King of France, whose ambitions and desires will dominate the continent for the second half of the century and going into the early 1700s. So we'll start off with the 30 Years' War, which is, just like it sounds, is a war that lasted 30 years. It started off by religious controversies and conflicts. It largely stems out of the Reformation that is about 100 years old by the time we get into the early 1600s. And the Catholic groups and Protestant groups are still arguing with each other into the early 1600s over largely if the Protestants should be allowed to survive or if the Catholics are going to be able to force them back into Catholicism, into the Catholic Church, what we today call the Catholic Church. So there had been several other wars between Catholics and Protestant powers in the 1500s that had led to a major peace treaty called the Peace of Augsburg, where both sides basically agreed to continue with their own religious traditions and let their enemies basically survive. But each side was not happy with that peace treaty because each side accused its enemy of never really following what the treaty demanded for them to do by giving back land and favors and all these kinds of things. So as we see on this map, what we today call Germany, which was back then split into hundreds of different little principalities and duchies and all kinds of kind of local level governments. The Germanies are really separated pretty heavily into the different religious movements because you have about 200 different governments. You have about 200 different government leaders that are choosing which religion their people should follow. So there's a very large fragmentation or a very large split throughout what we today call Germany as different leaders chose different religious beliefs. They're all basically Christianity, but they're different viewpoints or different sects of Christianity. So there's a kind of Catholic and Roman Catholic areas that are most pronounced in the South and the West. And there's Lutherans and Calvinists and other Protestants that are mostly dominant in the North. And you can see the breakdown by group on this map. But even in the areas that have some amount of kind of a majority Catholic or Protestant basis, even those areas still had large minorities of kind of the other belief systems in their populations. So these areas are not what we would call monolithic. They're not dominated by just one religious viewpoint. There's people even in those majority areas that are kind of disagreeing with what the majority opinion is. So this is a giant potentially political problem. There's religious controversies, there's arguments, there's debates, but when the political leaders start accusing each other of being underhanded or deceitful or refusing to follow what God wants for humans or something like that, then it can grow into actual warfare between different governments. So there's that ongoing potential in the early 1600s that really comes to a head when a new guy gets to be the leader of the Holy Roman Empire in 1619. The Holy Roman Emperor who was on that throne died in 1619. So the next guy, basically his son, will become Ferdinand II, the next Holy Roman Emperor. And Ferdinand II has much larger demands for all the areas under his control, theoretically. The Holy Roman Emperor was basically the so-called kind of unity leader of all the German realm, so all those 200 different local governments. And this Holy Roman Emperor wants all of them to go back to Catholicism, because he himself was personally a very dedicated Catholic, and he thought that that was the mission that God had given him, to bring all the people under his control back under Catholicism so that he can help them get into heaven and whatnot. So he starts making demands on all these Protestant princes throughout the Holy Roman Empire, even before he got to the throne, starting in 1618. It's pretty obvious that his father was dying and that he was going to be the next in line. So he started making statements and demands, and a lot of Protestant princes are really scared of this guy because he has quite a lot of influence, and they're afraid that he's going to be able to gather all the Catholic princes together and form a new kind of alliance to force the Protestants back into the Catholic Church. So this actually starts off an early revolt in Bohemia in 1618, where Ferdinand's representatives, his ambassadors basically, went to meet with some Protestant leaders, and the Protestant leaders threw them out of a window, and they fell 70 feet but survived. So that starts off this conflict between Ferdinand, the so-called central government of the Holy Roman Empire, and several of these Protestant princes who had taken part in that meeting. So that kind of kicks off the conflict. And we can see on this map that the Holy Roman Empire is theoretically drawn over all of what we would today call Germany. So the Holy Roman Empire theoretically is supposed to have kind of religious authority and even political authority over those 200 or so different German governments. So Ferdinand II basically goes to war against these Protestant princes and realizes pretty quickly that there's too many of the Protestant princes, so there's no way that he can actually win a war against all of them at the same time. So he calls up some allies in other parts of Europe to help him out, namely the King of Spain. So Spain still has a gigantic army, they still have a lot of tax revenue, and they decide to intervene and send troops into the Germanies to help Ferdinand II win this war. The rebels, the Protestant princes, realize that they probably cannot win a war against Ferdinand II and Spain in an alliance. So the Protestant princes start gathering together and trying to form an alliance amongst themselves, and they start asking for help from other Protestants around Europe to send in armies. So this becomes a large international conflict that is not just in the Germanies anymore. The conflict goes on for the first couple years. So into about 1620 or so, there's sporadic fighting until it's a very large Catholic victory at a place called the Battle of White Mountain near Prague in November 1620. So in that military victory on the battlefield, the Catholics virtually destroy the Protestant armies who had showed up to fight. And from there, the Catholic armies start to invade the other Protestant areas and demand that they revert back to Catholicism, and if they don't, the Catholic armies occupy the areas and basically lay siege. They surround the areas and wait for them to surrender, either through just giving up or possibly just starving to death. So this siege-type warfare keeps going year after year until 1623, and it looks like the Catholic forces are eventually going to win this thing until we get a pretty interesting development in 1623. And this shows that geopolitics, kind of the relationship of different governments according to their geography, how close they are to each other, and if they're at war or not, plays a much more important role in this war than religion does. So it's supposedly a religious war. It's Catholics versus Protestants, but it will drag on so long because other governments will be afraid, especially of Catholic power generally taking over the whole Holy Roman Empire. And the first one that will intervene is the King of Denmark, who will intervene in 1625. So Denmark is, if I can get my mouse working, Denmark is up here north of the Holy Roman Empire. It's still a kind of Germanish-speaking type of area, but it's this kind of series of islands and peninsulas that stick out north of what is today Germany. And the King of Denmark was very worried that if Spain and the Holy Roman Empire are able to conquer and control all of the Germanies, that Spain's next attempt at getting even more land might be just to invade northward from the Holy Roman Empire, go north and invade Denmark and start taking over Denmark's land. So the King of Denmark was very worried about that. So he decided to launch a preemptive strike and attack southward into the Holy Roman Empire, to basically let the Spanish know that that's not going to be tolerated, and maybe to gain some land for himself in what would today be northern Germany. So he started that in 1625. Did not really go very well because the Spanish army is much larger, much more powerful. So the Spanish counterattack actually invades Denmark and starts conquering Dane cities. And almost got to the Danish capital city, which caused a lot of worry, obviously, amongst the Dane government, the King of Denmark. So in 1629, in the midst of all this fighting, it turns into basically a standoff. The Danish army is not strong enough to kick the Spanish completely out of Denmark, but the Spanish army is not supplied well enough to conquer the Danish capital. So it's like this standoff, that stalemate that neither side can really win. So eventually they sign a treaty in 1629 that ends the Danish intervention. But when that happens, the country next door, even further to the north, Sweden, the King of Sweden is worried now that the Spanish king is increasing their influence further and further north. So the Swedes decide to intervene in 1630 to try to stop that also. So the King of Sweden is a Protestant. He's very worried about the Spanish and especially Catholic power increasingly growing north further and further and further. So it's basically the same thing as the Danish intervention. The Swedish intervention is an attempt to stop the Catholic encroachment and possibly even to get some more land for Sweden out of it too. So this Swedish intervention will kind of renew the war and will go on for 5 years until really all the major leaders that have been involved in the conflict since the beginning tend to die off in 1635. And that leads to a new peace treaty where the Catholics and the Spanish and the Swedes agree to basically to stop fighting each other. So at that point it looks like the war might end all by itself. But this is when the French start getting worried that not just Catholic power is growing, but Spanish and possibly even Austrian power is growing. We have to remember that the Holy Roman Empire is led by the Habsburg family, which is also in control of Austria as just the King of Austria, basically. So France, under a Catholic leader named Cardinal Richelieu, had been giving money to Protestants to fight Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. So France had been giving money and supplies to Denmark and Sweden and really any other Protestant princes that are willing to fight off Spain and Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor. So it's been doing that throughout the war, but now it looks like the war is ending. So France decides to intervene in order to basically try to keep the war going in order to destroy Spanish and Holy Roman Empire's power, because they surround France, to really knock them back a few pegs. And that French intervention starts in 1636 and goes pretty badly for France. Spain will attack across the Pyrenees mountain range from into southern France, and will start conquering parts of France and occupying parts of France. And the French armies will try to fight that off. So that's France's big problem, really, until Richelieu died in 1642, so 6 years into this conflict. Richelieu is out, and the King of France died the next year. So the French government comes under new leadership. So King Louis XIV is only 5 years old when he becomes King of France officially in 1643. And 5-year-old's not going to run the country, so the French government appoints a series kind of group of advisors to basically run France. And that new group of advisors decides that this war was a disaster, so they immediately stop the war and open peace negotiations in 1643. The problem, though, is that these peace negotiations are going to be extremely complex, because this war has been going on for 25 years by this point, by the time peace negotiations even start, and has involved like 100 different governments. So they all have to get together to sign off on the final treaty to end this gigantic conflict. So the negotiations are extremely difficult, because it's hard to get 100 different groups to agree on anything in the world, much less how you're going to redraw the map of Europe to end this war, and possibly give some money around and that kind of stuff to appease everyone who is in the war. So the peace treaty is not officially kind of signed until in pieces until starting in 1647, and then finished off in 1648 in what becomes known as the Peace of Westphalia. And this peace treaty has a lot of very important results for Europe as a whole. So we'll go through those kind of step by step for the next section. The Peace of Westphalia is seen as one of the giant turning points in European history for these many reasons that we're going to get into. So reason number one, the Habsburg family, who at this point is on the throne of both Spain and Austria, and has holdings in all these different areas, in the Germanies, in what is today Italy, as we can see on this map. That's all under one family, and so a lot of other Europeans, especially France, are very worried that at some point the Habsburg family is going to figure out how to bring all those territories under one person in their family. That's going to be simultaneously the King of France, King of Austria, King of parts of Germany, southern Italy, all these other places, and that such a king would be so wealthy and powerful that he could basically launch some type of war to try to conquer the rest of the continent and just control everything in Europe. So a lot of other Europeans, especially France, is very worried about that. And the Peace of Westphalia basically says that the Habsburg family can stay on the throne of Austria and Spain and some other places too, but all that can never be unified under one person. So there has to be a separate King of Austria who is in the Habsburg family, and maybe one of his cousins or something will be King of Spain, and then another cousin will be King of southern Italy, or whatever the lands you want to point out. So there's this international agreement in 1648 that the Habsburg family will never be allowed to unite all that lands under one person. Another big part is that a lot of the major leaders by the mid-1600s basically are forced to admit that these so-called wars of religion cannot be won. These wars between Catholics and Protestants are virtually impossible to win because neither side is willing to give up. They think that their belief system is what God wants people to do, and so they're willing to fight and to be captured, tortured, and executed, or die on the battlefield, rather than give up those beliefs. So you can never fully eradicate those beliefs. There's always going to be people out there who believe it, and if they think that's what God wants them to do, they're always going to be willing to fight to the death for it. So these religious wars are impossible to win, because you can't convince them to give up, and you can't convince them to change their mind. So these wars, by 1648, all the major leaders, you don't have to write down all these names, but a lot of these people are all dead by the time 1648 rolls around. But they're all examples of how different governments had tried to fight religious wars, like Charles V or Ferdinand II, or other leaders who openly admitted by the early 1600s that even in their own country, like Elizabeth in England or Henri IV in France, they admit that there's no way that these religious wars can possibly be won, even in their own country, much less, internationally across all of Europe. So 1648 basically teaches the rest of the European leaders to follow that understanding and really admit that no Catholic or no Protestant is ever going to be able to eradicate the religious minorities in their own countries. So the general belief really becomes after this that as long as your people are following some form of Christianity or another, then that's probably going to be good enough, or is going to have to be good enough. So the Holy Roman Empire is forced to recognize, and the Holy Roman Emperor himself is forced to recognize that there's going to be a lot of Protestants that remain in the Germanies and in the Holy Roman Empire, and you're just going to really have to accept that. So there's going to be some amount of religious and maybe even political fragmentation going into the future in the Germanies. Next step is that Spain formally relinquishes its control over certain areas. So one of the big ones is here on the left. The Kingdom of Portugal is carved out and created as a new independent country again. Well, it had been an independent country before, but is made back into an independent country in 1648. And they have their own separate monarchy, and they will be their own country for the future. And also Spain is forced to finally give up its attempt to control the Dutch area, which had basically been a Spanish colony off and on for a long time, and 1648 finally forces Spain to give full independence to what becomes known as the Dutch Republic. So we have arrows pointing to those two newly emergent countries. And the Dutch Republic in the late 1600s and even into the 1700s is going to be a major economic and military power in Europe. So the creation of the Dutch Republic is a big turning point for Europe in a lot of different ways. So Spain is basically forced to accept this because it had largely lost the 30 Years' War. Its big ally in the conflict, the Holy Roman Empire, its armies are basically bled dry, a lot of death and destruction. So those countries are allowed to emerge, the Dutch Republic and Portugal, as independent entities with their own governments, and especially the Dutch will become a very important country into the future. And with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire being so heavily damaged in this conflict, France is really the biggest endpoint winner. Because France is rising in power at the same time that Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the kind of previous major powers of Europe, are falling in power. So in 1648, it is pretty clear that France is going to be probably the most powerful and important country in Europe going into the future. And the fifth big result is that the Peace of Westphalia basically says that no one country should be allowed to have so much power that it can dominate all the other European countries. So there's this idea that comes to be known as the balance of power, that whenever one country starts growing to become so possibly dominant over the rest will really form a grand alliance in order to knock that one country back. Because if any one country becomes so dominant, that means it might try what Spain had just tried, to really take over the rest of the continent and create a European-wide monarchy under French control, or anybody's control, really, Spain or the Germans or really whoever. So this idea of the balance of power will become a central idea that will continue to govern Europe for the next 150, almost 200 years. And any country that tries to rise up as way more powerful than the rest will basically get afraid of it and unite to take it down a few pegs. And that'll lead us directly into the next section, which is the rise of French power. So France, under its new monarch, Louis XIV, is going to rise up and be really the dominant power, or the most important power in Europe. And that balance of power idea will come into play over and over again in the late 1600s as the other European countries will really start to fear France quite a lot. So last time we talked about France and going into 1648, their former king had died in 1643. Louis XIII was out. He died in that year. And his, I believe it was his son, Louis XIV, will become king, even though he's only 5 years old. So like I said before, he's not going to be trusted. No one's going to trust a 5-year-old to actually run a government. So the French government kind of brings all of its highest advisors together, and they set up what's known as a regency council to govern in the king's name until the king grows up and becomes an adult and is kind of mature and kind of intelligent enough to actually be trustworthy and govern the country himself. So this starts when he's 5 years old and will continue until he's in his early 20s. So so the regency is really running the country, negotiates the Peace of Westphalia for France. And once that peace treaty is signed, another conflict breaks out inside France. It becomes known as the Fronde, which is basically a revolution of several French big landowners, the nobility, against the monarchy, and goes for 5 years. Eventually the monarchy wins under the regency that is running the government. So the government puts down this revolt. But we have to remember that this starts when Louis XIV is about 10 years old or so. And it goes on for 5 years. So this is when Louis is kind of growing up and he's being taught about politics and government and what his responsibilities are going to be as king. So this kind of fairly chaotic 5 years of his life really teaches him a lot of things, and a lot of historians argue that he becomes obsessed with power and central government and putting down any dissent or any complaint. Because he learned to worry about this stuff at a young age. So he'll be obsessed with that for the rest of his life, many historians will argue. So the Fronde is put down, and Louis continues learning. He has private tutors, obviously, because he's a king. And the leader of the regency himself, another Catholic cardinal named Mazarin, died in 1661. So at that point, Louis is 23 years old, and when the regency leader dies, Louis issues a formal document saying that he is personally taking control of the government now that he's an adult and he can start running things. And he quickly starts making really important changes to the French government. So he starts a series of major reforms that are going to do quite a lot to build up French government power, not just within France itself, but in relationship to other European countries. So the first one he does is pay off the national debt. France had gone into debt, had borrowed a lot of money to fight the 30 Years' War and these other conflicts. So when, just like today, if you're in debt, you owe someone money, you're making monthly payments, it often is a kind of drain on your resources. So Louis decided very quickly to try to pay off the entire national debt so he doesn't have to make those kind of monthly payment to his bankers, the government bankers. People had loaned the government money previously at interest. So he decides to pay it off so he doesn't have that drain on his resources going forward. Second, he creates, with his advisors, a much more efficient tax collection system. And that means that France at the time has probably the biggest population of any European country, somewhere around 20 million or so. And France has one of the booming economies because it has the biggest population, has more people, has more businesses to tax. So they reformed the tax structure in order to make tax collection more efficient, which again gains more government revenue on a yearly basis and is much more efficient than any other European tax collection system. So the French government has more money to spend going into the future. He invests quite heavily a lot of that money in building up a French navy in order to, what historians call, project power out into other world regions, especially to build up a French empire, to colonize other valuable places and control them, to increasingly grow the French economy, make more money through international trade, which will benefit the government through more taxation. So, or even consistent taxation. If you have a growing economy and you keep your tax rates steady, then the government will get more and more revenue on a yearly basis. And another big one is what Louis called the réunion policy, which means the reunion policy, bringing people back together, basically. But for the French government, the réunion policy is to bring French people back into France. And the idea is really that France has a kind of questionable border. Especially the northeastern part of France has these lands that are easy to invade. So Louis and the government's idea is to send French government lawyers into those areas and look up all the historic treaties and land deals that have happened in the archives, and basically file lawsuits arguing that at some point the French government had owned this land and that someone kind of took it from the French government somehow or other. Basically lawsuits arguing that the French government should own these certain pieces, eventually very large pieces of land. And they're not just doing it for any land, they're doing it for land that they think will be valuable to control in case of a war, to kind of solidify France's defensive position. So they want to gain control over land that has a much better kind of military strategy to be able to defend that land against foreign attack. And we'll take a look at a map real quick. So this is a map of all the areas that the previous French monarchs and Louis, and even after Louis, will gain control over, the past several hundred years, from the 1700s going back into the 1500s. And you can see by the, if I can get my mouse going, you can see by the key on the right, Louis XIV's areas that he gained control over through this réunion policy is in this kind of orangish shade. So all these orangish type areas are areas that Louis's government went after in his lifetime. And you can see they're all along the border, but especially in the north and the east. And you can see also that Louis is gaining control over far more land than really any other king, except maybe for the king after him, Louis XV will gain control over a big chunk in the northeast. But Louis XIV's attempts at the réunion policy gained much more land for France and good defensive position land to try to repel any foreign invasion than any other king really in this whole era for about 300 years or so in French history. So that's what they're doing, and they start off with lawsuits, and if the lawsuit succeeds, that's great for Louis, and they kind of take legal control over some land. If the lawsuit fails, Louis tries the next strategy, which is basically to send a bunch of French troops into that area and point guns at the people running that area, like the local city council or whatever you've got there. Basically send in French troops and put guns to those people's heads and say, how would you like to be French from now on? And not very surprisingly, when they have a gun put to their head, they say, yeah, sure, I'd love to be French now. And the French king can now control this land. So a lot of this is done not so much through just legal arguing and legal process, but just threat of warfare and threat of assassination to anyone who resists this idea. So that's another way that Louis kind of accomplishes a lot of this stuff. And another major thing that Louis does is to build Versailles, which is a kind of, it's not so much the capital city because the official capital is still in Paris, but Versailles is a few miles outside of Paris, and it's going to be kind of Louis's official personal residence. That is going to be like this massive series of palaces and gardens and fountains and all this kind of um, just overwhelming area that takes huge amounts of money to build. And Louis builds it to really advertise his greatness and his wealth and privilege, and how everyone in the world should be in awe of him. So that's what Versailles is, and it's still around today. It's mostly a museum today. So these are some images of Louis XIV that are from museums, are very famous. So you see the one on the left kind of advertises him as like the god of war, and even has this angel up in the top left kind of portraying him as like God is on his side and all these things he's doing internationally. And the image on the right is Louis showing off how wealthy and privileged he is. Because we have to remember at this point in the 1600s, most French people are basically peasants. They live out in the farms, they grow food, they maybe own 2 or 3 sets of clothes, they have a little tiny peasant house, they don't have any money, so they're mostly working just to grow enough food to survive, to eat. Whereas Louis gets to live like this with extreme amounts of clothes that are perfectly cleaned, and wigs and hairdos and all these kinds of very expensive things. So these kind of images show off Louis's power and his extreme wealth compared to virtually anyone else in the world. So Louis is at like the height of absolutism, the height of a king's ability to control his own government, and other kings try to emulate a lot of this. So this is a kind of fashion trend that he starts, and other kings start having portraits of themselves drawn in this very kind of extravagant way to show off all the wealth that they have. So Louis becomes known as the Sun King in France. Of course, the government advertised him as that to convince people to support him. But he's also seen internationally as the most powerful monarch in Europe and the height of absolutism. And other monarchs try to emulate him and try to empower themselves over their own people and their own governments in similar ways. All this military spending, and especially France's new wealth with its high tax rates, encourages what historians have called a military revolution in the 1600s. That has a lot of different kind of causes and pieces. One is just that the governments, especially the French government, started building armies out of their own people, which we fairly see as normal today, but was very different in the kind of ancient type of world. A lot of governments back then relied on mercenaries. They would hire foreign soldiers. Like the King of France would hire soldiers from some German area or Italy or somewhere like that, and just basically pay them to go fight whenever the king had to go to war. That was seen as pretty unreliable, especially in the 30 Years' War, because a lot of those mercenary soldiers basically changed sides whenever someone else offered them more money. So especially Louis and the French government learned that they should start building armies out of their own French people, because those people will be much more kind of nationalistic and patriotic and willing to follow orders and fight for the country rather than fight for just a paycheck. So, but that also means that if you're going to build up that army, you're going to have to maintain it for the long term. The benefit of having mercenary soldiers is you only pay them when you're fighting a war. When you're not at war, you don't have to pay them, so they have to go out, somewhere else and take care of themselves and provide their own food and shelter and all that. But if you're building an army out of your own people, a national army, you have to keep those soldiers trained and fed and clothed and housed and ready to fight and supplied. So this makes the cost of keeping an army much, much larger in the 1600s under this kind of nationalist army type of idea. And the armies are becoming increasingly expensive to supply. 1600s is also when Europeans will start using more muskets, gunpowder weapons, so handheld guns. They will also start making more powerful artillery, so cannons that fire even eventually exploding shells, called a howitzer. So those cannons have to be much, they use more gunpowder, so the cannon itself has to be much stronger. So it takes more metal to make the cannon, which makes it more expensive to produce and buy. The guns themselves start getting basically knives put on the end called fixed bayonets. So the guns are much more expensive to produce, and you have to train the soldiers, especially with the cannons, are much more difficult to fire because they're so much more powerful. So you have to be basically an engineering student to know how to fire and to fire the weapon, and to train a group of soldiers to fire and reload the weapon consistently enough to have a real effect and actually hit the target accurately. The military training levels go up, which means you have to pay more to train an individual soldier to be able to fight with all this stuff. So the cost of keeping an army start to skyrocket, in especially the late 1600s. But the benefit is that these armies tend to move faster. They hit harder because they have more artillery. They have more gunpowder weapons. So an attacking army is much more powerful now, which means that the French government also gets paranoid that opposing governments are going to learn how to do all that stuff. So the French government starts trying to figure out how to build more reliable defensive systems, basically forts, to withstand those types of improved attack. And the French government leader who starts to design much more expensive forts is named Vauban. You see a picture of him here. And you also see kind of images of his strategy to create these very complex fortification systems that kind of reinforced each other through different levels of walls going into interior walls and pointing out in different directions and whatnot. So that's his attempt to figure out how to defeat the increasingly powerful invading armies. And they start building these forts up and down the French border. And obviously the end result is that the price of building forts goes up along with the price of building attacking armies. So that means that France still has an even bigger advantage now because France has the biggest population, the biggest economy, and can gain more tax revenue from its people than any other country. So if the cost of warfare is going up, that means that the richest countries are going to be able to have an advantage because they can pay for it, whereas other countries might not be able to afford that higher cost of fighting wars. So France, under Louis XIV, is undoubtedly the most powerful country in Europe in the late 1600s. And that will lead to a general series of wars starting in 1688. That's most of the result of the other European countries around France getting angry at Louis for all the things he's done by encroaching on their lands and whatnot over the past few decades. He revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which basically he demanded that everyone in France has to be Catholic now, so he stops tolerating Protestantism, which angered all the Protestants all around Europe. And he even gave money to the Ottomans to attack Austria because he viewed Austria as a potential enemy. And so that angered the Europeans because now he's helping the foreign invaders, the Ottoman Empire, Muslim armies come into southeastern Europe to attack. And he's helping do that just because he is enemies with who the Ottomans want to attack. So all this stuff has angered other European leaders for years and years, and that finally kind of explodes into a large series of wars that historians kind of generally put together in one that they call the 9 Years' War that starts in 1688. And this war is basically France versus all the other major powers of Europe. So France versus England, the Dutch Republic, Spain, Austria, and a bunch of, especially the German Protestants. They're all angry at France at the same time, or afraid of what France might do in the future. So once the war broke out, a lot of these potential French enemies all formed this grand alliance to try to knock France and Louis back down so that they'll kind of hurt his power going into the future. The problem, though, is that France has all these damn forts up and down its border, so really no German prince or king has enough of an army to attack those forts successfully. So there's basically a stalemate in northeastern France as there's invasions coming in, but they aren't very successful, really. The English government realized it doesn't have a big enough navy to try to invade France in this war. So the English mostly go for attacking French colonies around the world, so a colonial war outside of Europe. The Dutch, they say that they're involved in the war, but they don't really directly attack France so much. They're much more interested also at attacking French colonies. But the Dutch leaders are really just very worried about upsetting the French too much. So the Dutch are kind of theoretically involved in this war, but they're mostly trying to stay on the sidelines as much as they possibly can. So the real only major threat left to France is from the south in Spain. So Louis's government, the French, actually launched a preemptive strike and a series of invasions into northern Spain and conquer some areas. But the 90 Years' War is really just a long stalemate. Neither side can gain the upper hand because none of these other countries has the power to attack France directly by itself, and they don't really communicate with each other very well. Probably would have been much better for them to kind of make a grand plan, like a large scheme of how they're going to defeat France and then kind of apply it consistently over time. But a lot of times they don't even really trust each other that much, so their communication isn't very good. And as powerful as France is, France cannot take on all these areas at the same time and defeat them. It's just too much for them to accomplish. So it ends up being a long series of stalemates. And eventually the war is ended in 1697. And it's really surprising and impressive that France was able to fight this war for so long, for 9 solid years, without really losing any territory, and actually gaining some territory from Spain. Because France has really taken on every other single major power on the continent all at the same time. So it's quite an accomplishment that even France could fight to a stalemate. So there's a treaty that's signed in 1697 to end the war. The treaty is fairly easy to understand. Louis had to give up a lot of those Réunion lands that he had kind of taken over one way or the other over the previous decades. Louis formally recognizes the Protestant leaders of England, and Louis gives back all the land that France had conquered in Spain in order to stay on Spain's good side, because the French government wants to have good relations with Spain into the future for reasons we'll get into in a little while. But one reason that these wars went on for so long is that England is becoming such a major power. And that's largely happening in the 1690s while this war is going on. It's going on because of a few things. There's a giant so-called revolution in England in 1688, 1689 that kicked out the Catholic monarchy and brought in a Protestant monarchy. And that new Protestant monarchy will work with Parliament, the elected lawmakers of England, to make some major changes in the 1690s that will make England into one of the major powers of Europe, eventually getting to the level of France in the next few decades. So number one, they create a national sales tax, what back then they used to call an excise tax. And they also create a national nobility land tax. So they tax the land owning of how much land each major landowner owns and has control over and profits off of in England. So those create two huge tax revenue streams that will continue to provide consistent revenue to the English government in the next several decades. So the excise tax, the sales tax, is just a tax on the daily purchases. And the land tax is a real big one because that's a tax that goes after the real source of wealth, landowners throughout the country. England also in the 1690s creates a national debt system where the government will borrow internationally and agree to pay out with interest over sometimes decades, which brings even more international money into England. Basically, the investor class starts sending money into England because the interest rates that they're agreeing to are pretty favorable to investors. So a lot of money starts flowing into England. And they create the Bank of England to basically manage that. So it's the official government bank. So English finances are stabilized, streamlined, and are growing to a massive scale throughout the 1690s. London, the English capital city, also emerges to be Europe's largest city. So London had been kind of medieval small type town when England was a much lesser power in the 1500s. So London was the most important city in England, there's no doubt about that. But it becomes also the most important city in all of Europe as the population grows and the English economy, the London economy, grows by leaps and bounds in the 1690s and early 1700s. It becomes a manufacturing city and becomes a banking city also. And England in general starts producing more food than any other country in Europe, and also starts producing more goods in London than any other country. So the English economic growth is just stratospheric going into the 1700s, and London will be probably the most important city in Europe until the early 1900s. The English government decides to use a lot of this income to build up a gigantic English navy. The English navy was already fairly large after the 1660s, but in the 1690s they start spending massive amounts on the English navy. And the English Navy will grow to be the biggest and most powerful navy in the world in this time, and will remain so until World War II in the 1940s. And not only is the English Navy absolutely massive, but they sign a treaty with the Dutch Republic. The Dutch had been the other big naval power in Europe and the whole world in the 1690s. So when England and the Dutch kind of sign a treaty to have friendly naval relations and agree to help each other if the other one goes to war, it makes that alliance by far the most powerful naval alliance in the world. And they're both completely anti-France at this point, anti-Louis, basically. So all those things are extremely important for the long term in building up English power, and not just in England, but the ability to project power into the rest of Europe and into the rest of the world to build up the English empire. And the last one is years after this monarch, William III, died, England and Scotland joined together formally in a treaty in 1707 that creates the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Scotland. So this is where we see the transition from, we don't call this place England anymore, because England is only the south part, the south half of the island. Scotland is the northern part. So when they two join together, this is where we start calling this country, this united country, Britain, the Kingdom of Great Britain. And later on they will try to add Ireland into it, an island, separate island to the west. So they eventually become known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. So that doubles the amount of land that's under the English government's control, because now they have Scotland, and later they'll add Ireland, which means more population, more resources, more tax base. And a lot of this is going to lead into the kind of next problem that will emerge right around the year 1700. when the sitting king of Spain, named Charles II, who is a Habsburg, dies. The problem with Charles is that he was physically the result of a lot of basically inbreeding that we see amongst the royal families. These European royal families, they're all related to each other. They're all cousins or uncles or something like that with each other, because the monarchs do not want to marry with the general population, because the monarchs see themselves as more pure or better or basically elitist. So they do not want to intermarry with the commoners. And that's been a European thing going back hundreds of years. So by this point, the European royal families are really so inbred that a lot of their children have a lot of physical disabilities. And Charles II had quite a lot of that, to the point where it was difficult for him to eat and even talk. So he had a lot of physical problems. And one of them was also that he could not have children. So Charles II has no children to inherit the Spanish throne. So when it looked like he was on his way to dying at a fairly young age in 1700, that creates a whole series of controversies, because Spain is still one of the big powerful countries of Europe, still has this large empire in the Americas, and potentially can be a major power, if not the greatest power in Europe again. So as poor Charles II is kind of on his way out, and it's pretty clear that he's dying in his last couple of years, a lot of the other European monarchs are trying to figure out what's going to happen with Spain. Who's going to be the next Spanish king? So William III in England is desperately trying to stop a French takeover, and like the Austrians are arguing that, you know, they're the Habsburg family, so they should be able to appoint whoever they want to be the next Spanish king, and a lot of other Europeans don't want that, so it's this gigantic mess. And eventually, when Charles II is really dying, he's on his deathbed, he signed a will in October 1700 that gave all of his land and all of his holdings and all of his titles and all that stuff to Louis XIV's grandson, who is also heir to the French throne. Louis XIV's son has already died. So his grandson is the next heir to the French throne, and he, according to this will that Charles II in Spain signs, is making the heir to the French throne also heir to the Spanish throne. And, you know, Louis is very happy about that, because he feels he's going to be able to control his grandson, who is going to become Philip V, the King of Spain. So Louis accepts it, the French government accepts it, with the hope that this is going to be the French government's shot at taking control over all of Spain, and therefore the whole Spanish Empire, and really uniting France and Spain together in this giant Catholic alliance that really scares the rest of Europe, especially the Protestants, because that could be enough power to conquer the whole rest of the continent and take control over all of Europe. So that deal goes through, and Philip V becomes the new King of Spain under the Bourbon family, which is Louis XIV's family in France. But that directly leads to a new conflict, which starts in 1701, because so many of these countries are so pissed off about this. That becomes known as the War of the Spanish Succession, which is basically the war over who is going to be the next long-term king of Spain. England becomes a big leader of this, and it really is going to be England is going to get together a bunch of its old allies from the previous war against Louis to fight a new war to stop this alliance between France and Spain from taking effect. So the war is basically going to be France and Spain, because they're already on their thrones and they're cooperating, versus England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and a bunch of the German Protestants again. And this war will go on for basically 14 years. It's going to be a kind of pretty horrific thing. William III dies in 1701, his wife's sister. His wife had already died, and so her sister will become the next Queen of England, and her government's basically going to lead this alliance in fighting this long-term war. And again, it really devolves down into the same problem as the previous war. Spain and France, even combined, don't have the power to defeat all of its enemies at the same time, especially in all these colonial wars that are going to start emerging. And the same problem is true of the so-called Grand Alliance. England, the Dutch, Austria, the German princes, they don't have big enough armies to directly attack France and Spain. So it's really just there's fighting that goes on for all these years, but it turns into really just a stalemate. And eventually the big thing that kind of breaks the stalemate is that England, now Britain by the after 1707, is spent. It has spent virtually all the money it can get its hands on, and it's still not winning the war. So Britain declares neutrality after a while. It kind of bows out of the war, and the rest of the Allies cannot afford to keep fighting without Britain's financial help. So eventually a peace treaty starts to get negotiated in 1712, 1713, and a treaty is reached between the Grand Alliance and France. But Austria wants to keep fighting, so they keep fighting for another year until they get a separate treaty that ends the war between France and Austria directly. And this so-called series of treaties in 1713 and 1714 will kind of create the new stability, and so we'll talk about kind of the major results of this treaty system that will kind of carry forward for the next several decades into the mid-1700s. The first big result is that that French guy who was put on the Spanish throne is allowed to remain king of Spain. But the treaty says that the French and Spanish monarchies can never unite together. So this guy who's going to be king of Spain, he has to give up his ability to become king of France in the future. So someone else will be king of France when Louis XIV dies. I think it's in 1714 when he dies. But they will never be allowed to unite their two monarchies. Number two, the Catholic powers, Spain and France, again recognize that Protestants are running England, what is now Britain, and so the British Protestant kings will continue on their line down into the future, which is going to be important because the monarchy has a big problem in Britain that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Third, all these Italians who have also been fighting have been kind of split between, there's a lot of people in Italy who want Italy to become a unified country, but they can't decide whether they want to do that under leadership from Austria or from another part of Italy called Savoy. So that will that conflict between the Italian nationalists will prevent Italy from being unified into one country for over another 150 years. And the big result of this is that really that all the countries that fought in this gigantic war, the War of the Spanish Succession, the war had gone on for 13 years. They're all exhausted. Their soldiers have been killed. Their governments have been bankrupted. They've lost land. Their businesses have largely been destroyed. So they're all exhausted by the time this peace treaty system comes into effect. And they just can't afford to start another giant war for several decades. So most, especially of the major countries like Spain, Britain, France, Austria, they're so exhausted that they spend the next several decades just kind of rebuilding their economies and restabilizing their governments. And so they don't have any interest in fighting each other anymore for quite a long time. And the fifth result is that you get new monarchs in France and now Britain by 1714. So Louis XIV died in 1714, I think it is. Yeah, 1714. His great-grandson is the new King of France. So Louis XV is a very young child. So Louis XIV lived so long, he outlived his kids, he outlived most of his grandkids. So it's actually a great-grandson that needs to be put on the French throne when Louis XIV died finally. So Louis XV is very, very young, and so a regency council is set up in France again to run the French government in that child king's name until that child grows up and becomes an adult and kind of can take over and run the government himself. But that's going to take a couple decades. Also, Queen Anne of England died in 1714. And she did not have any children. So the English now start looking around for anyone that has any kind of tenuous relation to Anne, to bring them in, as long as they promise to be Protestant and allow Protestant toleration in England, in Britain by 1714. So they actually import a guy who was king of one of the German areas called Hanover. They bring him in 1714, crown him the new king of Britain, even though he doesn't even speak English. He speaks German. Knows nothing about English customs or government or anything like that. So he's basically a placeholder king, and therefore the British throne, the British monarchy feels very kind of wobbly, unstable, so they don't know if there's going to be a revolt against this or anything like that. So both the governments in France and Britain are looking for stability. They do not want wars. They want just things to be calm because, wars are tricky, they're unpredictable, and could lead to a lot of unknown results. So neither France nor Britain wants another major war to happen in the next couple decades or so. So they want to rebuild and stabilize and keep things nice and calm so that they can, again, just stabilize their government position for the long term. And so that will create a general era of peace in Europe that Europe hadn't seen for a long time, that lasts until about 1740 or so. There are smaller wars that break out between a couple of the different countries or so, but there's not a big continental-wide war for several decades. Like we've seen almost constant continental-wide war throughout the entire 1600s. So Europe enters a new kind of relatively peaceful and prosperous time, and largely because Britain and France are now cooperating down here at the bottom in the green section. They are the two most powerful countries in Europe without any doubt at all, and really in the entire world. And because they agree and cooperate to avoid warfare, they will keep the peace basically and force their allies to mostly keep the peace until at least the 1740s. So this chart shows us what we've largely started to see already, that the real dominant powers of Europe in the 1400s, late 1400s and throughout the 1500s was really Spain. First half of the 1600s was mostly the Holy Roman Empire after kind of Spain fell from power after the Spanish Armada failed. But when the Holy Roman Empire failed to control Europe and lost the 30 Years' War, that's when France came up under Louis XIV and really dominated Europe until he died in 1714. And then you get a kind of combination of France and Britain for the next several decades that will be the dominant powers. And France and Britain will continue a rivalry with each other for power, and they will mostly be the one or the other, or a combination of them, will be the most powerful country in Europe right through to the 1870s. So this goes on for well over 150 years. So we'll get to all that eventually, but we'll stop here for today.